Good evening, and thank you for joining us here at St George's Hall for what will be the last Roscoe Lecture of our bicentenary year. I would like to extend a warm welcome to the Lord Lieutenant of Merseyside, Mark Blundell, to our esteemed guests and friends of the university. 7 weeks ago, I stood on this spot and introduced Professor the Lord David Alton of Liverpool, a familiar name to many people here. Having founded the public lecture series at Liverpool John Moores University in 1997 as an example of the university's insistence on academic freedom and free speech, David was invited to return and present his reflections to mark Roscoe's 25th anniversary. In his lecture, David referenced the origins of Liverpool John Moores University with the creation of the Liverpool Mechanics Institute, and of course the College of Arts. Of note and significance 200 years later is the Institute's mandate that education is the key to progress. If you look to the current institution of Liverpool John Moores University, you'll find a statement that our mission is to develop exciting, brave, resilient people and embrace effective and impactful change. Tonight's lecture, delivered by one of our own graduates, provides us with a very real opportunity to support academic freedom and free speech, to truly see the possibilities for progress through education, to embrace change for the benefit of our students and communities. So it is my pleasure to invite Malik Nasir to present the truth that lies behind Roscoe. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor, Lord Lieutenant, esteemed guests, for taking the time out today when you could have been outside in the winter market getting high on the hog, but you're in here with me to listen to this lecture, and there's so many of you who have turned out. I'm truly grateful. Thank you so much. So I have had the kind of fortune of graduating from all three of Liverpool's universities. I did my undergraduate degree at Hope University. I did my postgraduate diploma at the University of Liverpool, and I did my master's degree at the Liverpool Screen School at John Moores University. And throughout the course of my academic journey, I have constantly sought to unearth truth. Now, when you say the word truth, people have different ideas about what that constitutes. In the old times, in the Greek days, if you'd have asked Plato what was truth, he would have defined it quite differently than what perhaps we do today. The word in Greek is aletheia, and Plato described it as that which necessarily is and could not be otherwise. And why did he describe it in that way? He described it in that way because there was an argument about relative truth and absolute truth. You can have your truth, and I can have my truth. So Plato did not translate aletheia as truth. He said that which necessarily is and could not be otherwise. The opposite of that was what was referred to in Greek as doxa. And the doxa is that which is construed to be true because enough people believe it to be so, even though it has no basis in reality. And the foundation of Athenian democracy was based on doxa. It was based on the idea that someone could campaign on a platform, that they could get everyone to buy into an idea, that people would vote for it, that they would be elected into office, and then they would do the complete opposite of what they were elected to do. And then every 4 years, when people were completely and utterly traumatized by the fact that none of the things that they voted for actually got done, they would then call an election, and they would reinstitute hope. So Plato condemned Athenian democracy because of its reliance upon the doxa. So I was very unfortunate as a young boy not to have a formal education. I went into care at the age of 9, and I emerged from that semi-literate at the age of 18. I spent most of my years when I should have been in school working on a farm in various different children's homes, and as a consequence of that, did not receive a formal education. So that was the downside. The upside of it was I was not constrained by the curriculum or any particular research paradigm. I was free to self-educate and to go in any direction I wanted to. But there was one thing that always drove me to understand more, and it was the racist attitudes that I faced as a kid when people kept telling me to go back to where I came from, and I didn't know where that was. My mother's white. She's from Dysyth, St Athath in Wales. That was pretty straightforward. My grandfather's from Holywell. But on my father's side, my father was a Watson, Scottish name, but he was black, and he was from South America, from Demerara, in what was formerly British Guyana. So my father died when I was very young. He was born in 1918. He fought the Nazis in World War II. He died when I was a teen. And I was in the care system, so I didn't really get to know him, and I never knew about anything about Demerara or Guyana other than that they had sugarcane, and Demerara sugar came from there, okay? But I wanted to find out who I am, where I come from. So I started on a quest to really understand my origins, if you like, because I was made to feel in the city of Liverpool very, very unwelcome, okay? I never felt like I belonged here. I was othered. So that resulted, if you like, in this sort of desire, not just to get back to Guyana, but also to really try and find the family tree. But what sparked it was a documentary in 2002 by BBC Scotland on a black footballer called Andrew Watson, who looked just like me, had the same family name as my father, came from Demerara, where my father came from, and he was a footballer in the 19th century in Britain who captained the Scottish national team in 1882, thrashed England 6-1 at the Oval, came to Liverpool and played for Bootle FC, who were the forerunners to Liverpool FC. At that time, Liverpool FC didn't exist. It was Everton and Bootle. They were the two football teams, okay? Went to London, played for the London Swifts, played for the Corinthians of the old Corinthian spirit, and he was just this remarkable find. So that set me off on a journey to really try and understand my family tree and who he was and whether or not he was related to me. So how does that link into Roscoe? Well, I didn't understand the connections to Roscoe until I started looking at the family of Andrew Watson and the slave trader that his father was. His mother was born enslaved. His father was a slave trader, Peter Miller Watson from Cranset in Orkney. And they came from a family who were a Scottish clan called the Robertsons of Kindaker. Now, when I came across Roscoe in the beginning, it was very incidental. In many of their family documents pertaining to their business operations, his name kept popping up, and I wondered what the relationship was. He seemed to be their guy. They used him for certain things. So, as I kind of delved into him a little bit to try and find out a bit more about him, we come across the narrative of Roscoe. So, as you can see here, view him as a husband, a father, a friend, a counselor, a votary of science, the promoter of the arts. Look at the school for the blind, the Athenaeum, the Lyceum, the Botanic Gardens. Such as Mr. Roscoe, such freeman of Liverpool is the man now offered to your choice. His virtues and deeds have already immortalized his name. It will be recorded and revered by your latest posterity. So this is when he's running for Parliament in 1806. Okay? And he voted, as we know, for the abolition of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. So he is lauded in his legend as the great abolitionist. And there are other great abolitionists also, William Wilberforce, William Ewart Gladstone. But the question for me, when I'm looking between the aletheia, that which necessarily is and could not be otherwise, as Plato described it, and the doxa, the commonly held beliefs that are construed as true because enough people believe it to be so, even if it has no basis in reality, I start to find that issue of Roscoe is far more nuanced than what we originally thought. So let's just take a look at some of the selection of the institutional partners that he was involved with. Let's take the Liverpool Athenaeum. There's current research going on at the Liverpool Athenaeum by a fantastic PhD researcher called Lucy Moynihan, who is looking into the original proprietors of the Liverpool Athenaeum. So this is, as the name suggests, an institution which was founded by Roscoe for the pursuit of knowledge and the dissemination of knowledge, okay? And it still exists to this day. I myself am a proprietor of the institution. We've got representatives of that institution here with us today. When we look at the people who were also proprietors and founders, we find George Case, co-owner of the slave ship, the Zong. So people will know the Zong as the famous case of the slave ship where 140-something enslaved people were thrown overboard by the captain because they were sick. And then he made an insurance claim, knowing that if he took them to market, he would only get a small percentage of their value because they were so sick. Whereas if he threw them over the side and killed them, he could claim the full amount of their value on the insurance claim. So the claim came up before the Lord Chief Justice. It wasn't an issue of murder of 147 people. It was an issue of the disposal of property and whether or not it was disposed of in a proper manner, okay? And whether it was right to give him insurance for the case or not. But George Case was involved in a lot of other slave voyages, as we'll see in a moment. The Zong was the famous one. But he was not only the co-founder with Roscoe of the Athenaeum, he was its first president. And then right after him, or shortly thereafter, Roscoe himself becomes president of the Athenaeum. So these are the kind of people that Roscoe's in bed with. Now you could say, well, there was an institution, there was two guys, this guy did bad stuff, this guy did good stuff. You can't hold him accountable for what others did. So let's have a look at the rest of the committee that he pulled together for the founding of the Athenaeum. So Lucy Moynihan's research has taken the register of slave voyages, where we know that these voyages definitely took place. It's not a comprehensive register. I found slave voyages that don't exist on this register. But it is a best case scenario. We know that there was no less than this amount of slave voyages and no less than these amounts of people trafficked on those voyages. And she took the names of the proprietors, the first 500 proprietors of the Athenaeum, and compared them to the slave voyages register. And she discovered that George Case, co-founder with Roscoe, was responsible or invested in 149 slave voyages between 1745 and 1808. And he personally was responsible for the trafficking of at least 46,012 enslaved Africans, of which 4,756 died or were killed during the Middle Passage. That's more people than died in 9/11. And this is one proprietor at the Athenaeum. The first shareholder, share number 1, George Case. I think share number 2 is Roscoe, okay? So this is not all of the committee, the first committee. I've extrapolated, with the exception of Roscoe, only those on the committee who were involved in slave voyages. William Lawson, 6 slave voyages, 1,442 enslaved Africans, 231 died in the Middle Passage. Mr. Litt, 24 slave voyages, 7,656 enslaved Africans, 802 died in the passage. You get the picture. As we move down to the bottom, I've just subtotaled these. Just the committee of one of Roscoe's institutions, the Athenaeum, just the committee alone were responsible themselves for 299 slave voyages, 90,993 enslaved Africans, of whom 8,663 were killed or died during the Middle Passage. Let that sink in. These were the people who financed William Roscoe. To other institutions, Roscoe got involved in a bank. There's a number of different scenarios that I've come across of various different people talking about how he got involved in the bank and how the bank folded. Some people said that there were some business partners that were friends of his and they were going to be destroyed and bankrupt if he didn't step in and lend credibility to the institution, and he stepped in and took shares and took over the bank, and then the bank collapsed. But the slave trader Thomas Leyland was his partner in the bank. Okay? Thomas Leyland was a massive slave trader in Liverpool, one of the big ones. So whether Roscoe was leveraged into the bank or not, he was in bed with a banker who was a slave trader. Okay? And he was enjoying the beneficial interest of the proceeds that were brought to that bank from Thomas Leyland. When Leyland pulls out, the bank went bust. And another slave trader tried to step in to save the bank, Arthur Haywood, whose bank, Arthur Haywood and Sons, was also a famous slave trading bank in Liverpool. They also opened a branch in Manchester. One of the brothers left and formed his own rival bank in Manchester, and he was also involved in the development of the Portico Library there as well, which was built on the same kind of principles of proprietorship as the Liverpool Athenaeum. He failed to save it. Roscoe was bankrupt. People know about Roscoe's bankruptcy, and they know that when he was bankrupt, much of his assets were being sold off, and some of his friends came out to buy back those assets to offer them back to him. He refused to take them. They ended up in various different places, Walker Art Gallery, various different museums. Some are at the Athenaeum in terms of his book collections, etc. But we can't just look at part of the story to extrapolate the bits that suit our sensibilities because we are talking about one of Liverpool's most famous sons. We need to speak the truth. And in order to speak the truth, we have to allow all the evidence to emerge, see it for what it is, and be willing to accept it, even if it upsets us. Okay? So Thomas Leyland later goes on with his nephew, Richard Bullen, and formed the slave bank, the slave trading bank, Leyland and Bullens, okay? Which I believe, I'm not sure if it ended up in Midland or NatWest, it ended up in one of those. Arthur Haywood and Sons ended up in Bank of Liverpool, which became Martin's Bank. You'll see the Martin's Bank building next door to the town hall in Liverpool, and that was also part of the portfolio of the family that Roscoe was then married into through his granddaughter, which I'm going to come to in a moment. So let's look at the family ties. So this is how I'm connected to Roscoe, because I found Roscoe in my family tree through slavery. Now, Roscoe didn't have any slave voyages, he didn't own any slave ships, he wasn't directly involved in the slave trade, he campaigned against slavery, we know this. But his granddaughter, Margaret Roscoe, born 1812, died 1852, she died quite young and childless, married Henry Robertson Sandbach. So if we go back to the footballer I was telling you about, Andrew Watson, his mother was born enslaved, his father, Peter Miller Watson, was a slave trader who ran plantations in Demerara. He had a brother who was an overseer on a plantation in Demerara called William Robertson Watson. I'm a direct descendant of him and his slaves. Okay? And that's how I'm connected to Andrew Watson. Andrew Watson, the footballer, is a distant ancestral cousin of mine. Okay? But Peter Miller Watson's mother, who I'm going to come to in a minute, was the sister of this woman here, Elizabeth Robertson. Okay? And they were two of three sisters known as the Three Fair Maids of Kilturn. Kilturn is a parish in Scotland, and they were born at the manse of Kilturn. Their father was the Reverend Harry Robertson, who was a doctor of divinity. His brother George Robertson was the founder of a slave enterprise in the island of Grenada, known as Robertson Parker & Co. He died in 1799 and left £250,000 in cash on day of death in 1799. That is billions in today's money. And he left endowments to Elizabeth Robertson, okay, his niece, and her sister, Christian, who I descend from. So Elizabeth married Samuel Sandbach, and their son, Henry Robertson Sandbach, married Roscoe's granddaughter. And that's how he came into my family tree. So Samuel Sandbach was one of Liverpool's biggest slave traders. He was the founder and he was a principal financier of many institutions. He was the founder or co-founder with other shareholders, but one of the principal shareholders of the Bank of Liverpool in 1831. The Bank of Liverpool then absorbed Martin's Bank and became the Bank of Liverpool Martin's Bank Limited. The Martin's Bank, it was then shortened to Martin's Bank, and Martin's Bank itself was the 6th largest bank in the UK when in 1969 it sold out to Barclays, and the Martin's Bank building next door to the Town Hall in Liverpool is still to this day, or it was until 2007, the regional headquarters for Barclays Bank. Samuel Sandbach owned plantations across Demerara, and he made a fortune from enslaving Africans on those plantations and producing sugar, rum, molasses, cotton, etc., that was brought back to Liverpool and sold in the exchanges here. In fact, his business partner, one of his business partners, Charles Stewart Parker, who also married Elizabeth Robertson's cousin, so they were all interrelated through family, ran their Glasgow operation that built the slave ships, had an insurance company called Caledonia Insurance, which insured slave cargoes, and ran their Scottish operation. And they continued trading for, well, I think the Sandbach Tinny Company, which they'd formed, continued until 1975. So these guys were involved and instrumental in taking the money that they were producing from this massive multinational slave-based conglomerate that they had developed across the Caribbean, and particularly in Demerara around the sugar, and investing it in organizations to better and uplift the people of Liverpool, including places like the Liverpool Athenaeum, the Liverpool Botanical Gardens, Egbert Hall Estate. You've seen Fulwood, Grassendale, Cressington Park. Samuel Sandbach was the architect of all of that. His family, you can go in the Maritime Museum and look at the archives there. There's a set of archives called the Bryson Papers. Bryson was a solicitor in Liverpool who used to go around all the solicitors' firms when they closed down and take all their papers, and all the deeds were there, and the Sandbach family deeds were there for the entire Egbert Hall estate. So you'll see where Samuel Sandbach's son, Henry Robertson Sandbach, this guy, is offering plots of land in Fulwood and Cressington Park and Grassendale for people to build their mansion houses, and then they were giving them mortgages through the Bank of Liverpool, and they were promoting trade in the city, okay? And they were building these institutions. Samuel Sandbach also, at one point, bailed out Liverpool Corporation, because the corporation at that time wasn't like Liverpool City Council today. It wasn't a civic authority that we know today. It was a group of bondholders. These were individuals who had investments in the development of infrastructure that would help them to ply their trade. If they needed a road to the docks, they built a road to the docks. If they needed a dock, they built a dock. If they needed street lighting, they built street lighting. They built the things that they needed, canals, railways, whatever it was that was going to give them the ability to bring their products to market, which were being produced on these slave plantations. So the Liverpool Corporation had a bill that was, there was a bill that was going through the House of Lords on corruption in local government. And the corporation's position was to oppose that bill. Clearly, they wanted corruption in local government. So the bill passed. And when the bill passed, Leyland and Bullens, who I mentioned earlier, who were the bankers, Thomas Leyland was so incensed by the fact that this bill had passed, he withdrew all his money from the corporation. And you can find records of this in Picton's memorials. And he took his money out of the corporation, effectively bankrupting Liverpool Corporation on that day. Samuel Sandbach, who was then Alderman Sandbach, stepped in and drew a check for the full amount of the debt on his bank, Arthur Haywood and Sons, and settled the entire accounts of the corporation on that day. The following day, the accounts of Liverpool Corporation moved from Leyland and Bullens to Arthur Hayward and Sons. Arthur Hayward and Sons had amongst its owners relatives of Samuel Sandbach, including Robertson Gladstone, because Samuel Sandbach's wife, Elizabeth Robertson, her third cousin was Anne Mackenzie Robertson, who was the wife of the MP Sir John Gladstone, one of the biggest slave traders in Britain, and the mother of the Prime Minister, William Ewart Gladstone, the longest serving Prime Minister in British history, who served 4 terms in office. So this is the level of connectivity that this family had, and only when you look at them as a family can you begin to understand the extent of their mercantile impact. So Samuel Sandbach's sister-in-law, Christian Robertson, 1780 to 1782, would have been Margaret Roscoe's aunt by marriage. Margaret Roscoe being William Roscoe's granddaughter, okay? Her first husband was James Watson, father of the plantation Demerara, Peter Miller Watson, plantation owner in Demerara, who had the child Andrew Watson, the footballer, with the slave woman, yeah? He died in his 30s. She had 5 children with him. I'm a direct descendant of one of those children and his slave, okay? Her second husband was Thomas Stuart Trail. Now remember the guy who died in 1799 with £250,000 from Robertson Parker and Co., George Robertson, yeah? Her uncle, she's receiving endowments from his will. And she's using her endowments to fund Thomas Stuart Trail. Okay? So Christian's wealth came from this slave trader, George Robertson. And when Samuel Sandbach was a young man, and Charles Stuart Parker, who was the guy who ran the Glasgow operation, was also a young man, they both apprenticed under George Robertson in Grenada. And when there was a slave revolt in 1795, Phaedon's Rebellion, they had a sloop in the bay, and they managed to just escape onto the sloop and got out with their lives. And they went to Demerara, and they set up shop in Demerara, and they didn't go back, to my knowledge, to Grenada. But Samuel Sandbach's uncle, who's also Samuel Sandbach, had plantations in Grenada. He'd made a fortune there, and he had 3 houses on Brompton Road that he'd left to Samuel Sandbach, okay, to his nephew. So Samuel Sandbach now has a bit of money. He's apprenticed under George Robertson. He then marries his niece. And then he rises up in the firm, and then he takes over the firm. Christian, her sister, is also receiving those annuities, but she's using her money to fund Thomas Stuart Trail, who is the direct partner with William Roscoe in the establishment of many of the Liverpool organizations that we know and love. I've extrapolated a couple of them here because there's too many of them to go into in any detail in a lecture that's only 40 minutes long. But to give you an idea of just the 2 key institutions, I've focused on his founding in 1823 of the Mechanics School of Arts, which many of you from LJMU will be familiar with, which then in 1825 was incorporated into the Mechanics Institute. Thomas Stuart Trail was its president in 1827. Benjamin Arthur Hayward of Arthur Hayward and Sons, which was the bankers who were going to bail Roscoe out when his bank was going under, who were also slave traders, was the vice president from 1828 to 1829, and John Gladstone, who was the single largest recipient of slavery compensation in 1837 after slavery was abolished, and was also the architect of the slavery compensation scheme that took £20 million that was earmarked initially for compensation, a large and liberal atonement for the slaves when they would eventually be freed, and some kind of way between 1823, when that conversation with William Wilberforce and Parliament started, and 1833, when the Emancipation Act was passed. John Gladstone managed to get it as, instead of it being a loan, it was a grant. Instead of being 15 million, it was 20 million, and instead of being for the enslaved people for having been enslaved as compensation, it would go to the slave traders for the loss of their slaves when they were emancipated. And John Gladstone was the biggest single recipient, and John Abraham Tinney, the son of Philip Frederick Tinney, co-founder of the firm Sandbach Tinney with Samuel Sandbach, was the second largest recipient of that. So Samuel Sandbach appears again and again and again in all of these organizations that Roscoe founded as a supporter in one capacity or another. Now, I don't look at people outside of this family. There are other people in the room like Lawrence Westcott, and there's Ray Costello and others who look at slavery in its totality and its generality in Liverpool. I don't look at that. I focus on this family and the people in this family, but for the purposes of this, I've also mentioned John Moss and John Bolton. I don't know of any familial connections with them, but they're also big slave traders who were very instrumental in funding this, along with Thomas Stuart Trail. So Thomas Stuart Trail is receiving money from his wife's endowments from slavery, and he is a doctor, he's a scientist, he's one of the people at the Royal College of Surgeons. You know, he's involved in all these organizations. And William Roscoe is this great networking guy who pulls all these institutions together. And it's almost as if you have this whole veneer of Roscoe and Trail at the front of these organizations. And then behind it, you have this really nefarious network of, you know, really, really deeply embedded slave traders with their funds, desperate to have someone to give them this kudos and credibility, and having endless amounts of money that they're willing to make available to them to fund these prestigious institutions. And as we know, that 1823, the Mechanics' School of Arts was the foundation of what today became John Moores University. Now, Roscoe and Trail together, in 1810, involved in the founding of the Liverpool Academy of Arts. Thomas Stuart Trail was brought in as the lecturer. William Roscoe was the treasurer. Henry Blundell, who was also a slave trader, was its first patron. In 1822, they were incorporated into the Royal Institution. The building of the Royal Institution, the main part of the building, still stands on Colquitt Street to this day. You will find the collection of paintings of the Royal Institution in storage at the Walker Art Gallery, okay? And they have some of the most incredible paintings, 20, 30-foot square paintings with big, thick frames. That are there to this day, not on display, most of them, but they are incredibly valuable, priceless works of art, which were again part of the assets of Roscoe that were sold off in order to be able to settle the debts of his failed banking ventures. And then they were bought back by various different friends of his, mostly slave traders, and deposited eventually at the Walker Art Gallery. So the Royal Institution is founded in 1814, and then the Academy of Arts is incorporated into it in 1822. And you find, again, the principal financier in this is John Gladstone, the biggest slave trader in Britain, probably at the time, or certainly one of them. And what does this institution become? It becomes the University of Liverpool. Now, what I found interesting when I looked at these institutions of knowledge production, why were slave traders so interested in creating institutions of knowledge production? And I found two reasons. One was they needed scientific justification for the things that they were doing. So they created what we would today regard as the pseudosciences, things like eugenics, the idea that, you know, white people were inherently superior to black people, that black people were the white man's burden, that black people needed to be controlled, they needed to be contained, they were best managed under the lash. You know, they couldn't be left to their own devices, they were infantile, you know, they were primitive, they were savage. These notions were perpetuated by these institutions' so-called knowledge, and then this pseudoscience permeated throughout society and came into the public discourse and eventually found its way into the public mindset and manifested itself in the ways that we would today regard as structural racism. Okay? So these things were predicated upon ideas that had no foundation in science, like black people's skulls were smaller, and therefore the brain was smaller, and therefore the capacity to learn was less. That black people were not on the boat with Noah, and were therefore not of Ham and Shem, and were not of the progeny of Adam and Eve, and had evolved through evolution as a separate subspecies that were closer in the evolutionary chain to monkeys than men, and therefore, could be regarded as property, not people. Ergo, in America, when they had the Constitution, First Amendment, every man has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it did not extend to black men, because black men were considered as only 3/5 man. So therefore, they were not a whole man, so therefore they could not have the constitutional rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay? And they could be regarded as property, not people, to be disposed of however you see fit, which is why when George Case, co-founder of the Zong, threw 140-something black men over the side, it was not a case of murder, it was a case of disposal of property. And it was said by the Lord Chief Justice that this is his property and he can do with it as he chooses. If he chose to throw 140 planks of wood over the side, that would be his discretion to do so, because he can dispose of his property however he chooses. So John Gladstone, Peel and others sat down and created these laws in Parliament, and they enacted this legislation to facilitate the legalization of these abhorrent things. And they then created these institutions of knowledge production in order to create the pseudosciences and the religious sciences to back it up. They were involved in the development of the Mechanics Institute in Manchester. They were involved in the development of Manchester College, Oxford. They were involved in the development of Newnham College, Cambridge. These were not one or two institutions. And they used the mentality that they had to create schools as well, like the Blue Coat. The Blue Coat was created by Blundell, a slave trader, with the church. And what did they do? They took poor English kids and indentured them, because they needed clerks for their merchant houses, and they needed governesses for their children. So people would come and they would indenture themselves, i.e. put a debt upon themselves and sign away their freedom, and work for several years to pay off the cost of their education. So the principle that was being developed was the same. That same principle found its way into the penal codes as well, where the poor laws, the vagrancy laws, and various other acts that were passed to sentence people to, servitude in the colony, to being sentenced to hard labor in Australia, etc., was all being enacted by these people because they had slavery. Then after slavery, they had apprenticeship. Then after apprenticeship, they had indentureship. And then after indentureship, they had, the only other way to take away a person's freedom is to criminalize them. So if we can criminalize them, we can put them on a chain gang and build the railroads. And John Gladstone was the architect also of the Liverpool-Manchester Railroad. Philip Frederick Tinney of Sandbach Tinney paid for the survey. You can see the original plans. They still, to this day, in the Athenaeum, for the land that was being used for that. Robertson Gladstone was the deputy chairman of the Liverpool-Manchester Railway, and these guys went on to then produce the railways right across the colonies and to create the necessary legislation in order to sentence poor people to hard labor in the colonies building the railroads. So that is a summary of some aspects of what I found when I looked into William Roscoe, because of his relationship to my family through Margaret Sandbach and her relation to Henry Sandbach, Margaret Sandbach being Margaret Roscoe, William Roscoe's granddaughter. So that concludes the truth that lies behind Roscoe. You may also know that I'm a poet. So the truth that lies, does that resonate with anyone? The truth that lies? Oxymoron? Yeah? The truth that lies. And that which lies behind, there's a double entendre there as well. because it doesn't just lie behind Roscoe, but it tells lies behind Roscoe as well. So the truth that lies behind Roscoe is really the message that I was trying to get a hold of today. And I know that there are many people here who would see Roscoe as, this unassailable sacred cow, Liverpool's most famous son. How dare anyone, tarnish the reputation of such a good man? I'm not attempting to do that. What I'm attempting to do is just reveal the truth of the situation as I found it. Thank you.